Welcome, everyone. I'm Deborah Parks, and I'm chair of our Distinguished Visitors Committee here at the Faculty of Law. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, David Petrasek, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is, however, trained as a lawyer and has extensive background in the field of international human rights, having worked as special advisor to the Secretary General of Amnesty International, for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the International Council on Human Rights Policy, and various NGOs and UN agencies. He has taught international human rights and/or humanitarian law courses at Osgoode Hall Law School, at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at Lund University in Sweden, and at Oxford University. So it's our great pleasure to have him here today to speak on Northern Neocons, the emerging exceptionalism in Canadian foreign policy. And I'll pass it over to David.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, the title's still a work in progress. And they said, I was asked, do I have PowerPoints? And I thought, with a title like that, I'm not going to put it in writing yet, because I don't know where the PowerPoints will show up. So, based in Ottawa, you just never know. Anyway, thank you. Thank you to the Law School and the Center for Human Rights for inviting me. 2013 marks the 65th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. December 10th, 1948, it was adopted. And I want to start with two quotations that were made within bureaucracies at the time about the Declaration. The first is from a senior diplomat, very senior, who was commenting on this Universal Declaration just a few weeks before it was finally about to be voted on. And I quote, "It would be difficult for us to oppose actively the adoption of a Universal Declaration, particularly as it's strongly supported by the United States and the United Kingdom. But we would not, repeat not, wish to be responsible in any way for its adoption in its present form at this session of the General Assembly." Unquote. The second quote comes from a memo that was prepared by another senior official and sent up to a prime minister for his approval, and he duly signed off on it. In that memo it said, "I feel sure that you will agree that the adoption of the Declaration in its present form," you will agree, Prime Minister, that the adoption of the Declaration in its present form at this session of the Assembly might prove to be a source of embarrassment to the government, particularly if our delegation were to take an active part in its adoption. We have real apprehensions concerning the adoption of a Declaration on Human Rights in terms that are open to criticism on juridical and political grounds, and which might serve to provoke dispute and contention in the domestic as well as the international field. Okay, the first quote was Lester Pearson, writing from New York, Canada's most famous diplomat, writing home to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the second quote was from a very senior civil servant, Jack Pickersgill, writing to Louis St. Laurent. These were the positions taken at the highest levels of the Canadian government in 1948, just a bare 3 weeks before the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canadian diplomats in New York then did as instructed, and 65 years ago, they abstained. They abstained when it came to a vote. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights came to a vote in the UN's third committee. This committee was taking a vote on the Declaration on to whether to forward it to the General Assembly for adoption. Canada abstained. The only other countries that abstained were those of the Soviet bloc and Saudi Arabia. Realizing that this was a public relations disaster, and being unable to explain the vote to anyone in New York, Lester Pearson convinced the Prime Minister at the time, Louis St. Laurent, that when the General Assembly voted 3 days later to finally adopt the text, that Canada should actually vote in favor. And Lester Pearson duly did so, although if you read the transcript of the time, he did so with a number of qualifications. Canada was not an enthusiastic, Canada's vote was not an enthusiastic endorsement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, the explanation appeared to say, we're only voting for it because we don't want to be with the people who are voting against it or abstaining, basically. Okay, my talk today isn't really about 1948, although I will return to that. But it's about today. And more precisely, it's about the last 6 years of the Conservative government and its approach to human rights in its foreign policy. I'm largely ignoring its approach to human rights in its domestic policy. The argument I'm advancing, and I hope you're going to comment on it because it's the first time I've done so publicly, and I'm sure it needs lots of work. But the argument I'm advancing is that the strong rhetorical commitment made to universal human rights by the Prime Minister and our current Foreign Minister, their constant reiteration that Canada will stick to its principles, and that these are repeated like a mantra by the Foreign Minister, freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Despite this commitment, this commitment actually masks an underlying retreat from Canada's commitment to universal human rights, or to the idea of universality. Now, what is this notion of universal human rights? It has several components, but let's just speak of 4. The first is the idea that all humans hold rights by virtue of being human. And it doesn't matter if you're born in Sri Lanka or South Africa or Canada or the Yukon or Quebec or Chile or Vanuatu. If you're human, you have these rights. They're universally held and they cross borders. The second idea is that all governments are bound by the same basic standards. There may be some choosing in terms of ratifications, but the Universal Declaration itself applies equally to all governments. The third is that all governments, by virtue of their membership in the UN, agree that they will be subject to some level of scrutiny. This is the idea of the international protection of human rights. Insufficient simply to have states ratify treaties and then leave it to their domestic legislatures and courts to enforce those. There has to be, however weak, however imperfect, some international scrutiny. It's central to the idea of universality. And fourth, that recognizing that human rights are political, nevertheless, governments should strive to be non-selective in how they raise human rights issues internationally, to raise them on the basis of abuse measured against international standards and not on the basis of partiality. Okay, the last 6 years in Canada show the emergence of a challenge to this idea of universality in 3 respects. 3 respects. First, there's an emerging belief that Canada is special. We're different. We're so good we don't have to bother about international agreements, even as we urge others to sign them. We ourselves can opt out of signing international treaties. Second, a determination to avoid signing up to new international scrutiny of our domestic human rights record. And in relation to scrutiny that we're already subject to because of previous agreements, we will deride it and belittle it and do anything we can to undermine it. And third, a selectivity in how we raise human rights concerns abroad. I would argue that this approach, these elements of this approach, are remarkably similar to the historical ambivalence of the US government to international human rights scrutiny. Those of you who've studied international relations, or others amongst you probably have heard this idea of American exceptionalism. America's ambivalence to international human rights treaties. The US has ratified very few human rights treaties. The US is very hostile to the International Criminal Court, refuses to ratify the treaty. You're aware of this, you understand that. This is said to be grounded in the idea of US exceptionalism. The US is a different sort of country. It's a country that need not be bound by the same rules as other countries because it has an inherent moral or an inherent goodness that lifts it above, if you like, the riffraff. And as such, it gets to set its own rules, and it gets to opt out of rules that it asks others to abide by. So the Canadian approach is similar to this US exceptionalism. And if we go back to where we started, 1948, I think that maybe what this tells us is that this recent trend in Canada, which I'm going to substantiate because it's a pretty strong charge, but this recent trend in Canada maybe isn't so aberrational at all. That maybe what we take to be a long record of promoting human rights was an interim between a original position of being ambivalent, and we're simply returning to that original position of ambivalence now, just like our US cousins. But let's see if the argument holds up. Okay, let's pursue it. There's a particular Canadian narrative in regards to our commitments to international human rights. Again, I'm speaking about our commitments internationally, not so much about domestic implementation, although we'll touch on that. But there's a particular Canadian narrative about about Canada's role in the world in relation to the promotion and protection of human rights, and is perhaps best expressed on the homepage of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I quote, Canada, you go DFATE, Department of Foreign Affairs International Trade, Google that, plus human rights, this page will come up. It'll say Canada's human rights policy, this is the first sentence. Canada has been a consistently strong voice for the protection of human rights and the advancement of democratic values from our central role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to our work at the United Nations today. That's not a conservative statement, that's not a liberal statement, that's a statement that's been there for more or less, in one form or another, for 20 years. Okay, around the Universal Declaration, we've seen it's not perfectly true, and I'll come back to that. But to continue with the homepage of the Department of Foreign Affairs, it also says human rights are, quote, a central theme of Canadian foreign policy, unquote. Why? Quote again, Canadians expect their government to be a leader in the field of human rights by reflecting and promoting Canadian values, unquote. Who could disagree? Who could disagree? We live in a time where it's common for politicians from whatever party in Canada to embrace the language of human rights. Since the late 1970s, despite the many changes of government, Canadian foreign policy has consistently prioritized the promotion and protection of human rights abroad. Different governments choose to prioritize different human rights themes, perhaps different countries, and sometimes political factors, of course, have shaped those decisions. But Canada has, since the late 1970s, consistently taken the lead in pressing international action on human rights. Look at the record. Strong supporter of decolonization efforts. Speaking out for civil and political rights in the Soviet bloc, especially after the Helsinki Accords were signed in 1975, which was an agreement between the West and the Soviet bloc, largely on security issues, disarmament, confidence-building measures, but it had a chapter on human rights that the Soviets signed up to, and that was used very aggressively by Canada on a number of issues in the Soviet bloc. In the 1980s, championing the struggle against apartheid, a Canadian government, a conservative government, was cajoling our UK and US allies to take bolder action to support democratic reform and universal suffrage in South Africa. Canada's been one of the first and most consistent champions of women's rights at the international level. The Ottawa Process, which led to the treaty which banned anti-personnel landmines. This was not just a Canadian initiative, but Canadian leadership was essential to see that happen in the late 1990s. The adoption in 1998 of the Rome Statute, creating the International Criminal Court. Canada worked very hard in the 1990s, was a key player in the negotiations that led to the adoption of that statute. You may have heard of this notion of R2P, the responsibility to protect, the idea that for the worst crimes, mass atrocities, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, sovereignty was not a defense. And where a state was unwilling or unable to protect its people against these most heinous of crimes, the international community had a responsibility to step in. Again, a Canadian initiative. And even today, excuse me, even today, our Foreign Minister John Baird regularly makes very strong and principled statements in defense of LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, freedom of religion, child marriage, etc. If you'll allow my own personal reflection, I worked many years as a lobbyist on human rights issues at the UN in New York and Geneva. And Canada wasn't perfect, particularly on issues that were very sensitive, the Indigenous issue, prominent amongst those. But generally speaking, when you needed a country to push a resolution, to sign on and sponsor something, to help you get access to a closed meeting, to brief you on discussions that were happening, to listen to bold and new ideas about what the UN might do, by and large, Canada was a very supportive government in the 1990s, and that crossed over both conservative and liberal governments. Okay, so that is a very solid record. There's no denying it. But remembering where we started with these quotes from 1948, we also know that Canada has not always been enthusiastic about the UN's human rights program. This statement that Canada, from on the Foreign Affairs website where they say Canada has been a, thank you. No, it's just this dry Winnipeg.
Yeah,
Dry cold. That's right, much preferable, by the way. You guys have to stop apologizing for your weather. I came here last January 31st. It was gorgeous like this. This is gorgeous, as long as you're dressed for it. I lived 7 years in London. Winter, it's never minus 30 or whatever it is today. But I was cold the whole time. It doesn't matter how many sweaters you put on. Anyway, that's an aside. On the Foreign Affairs website where it says Canada has been a consistent supporter since the time of our, including in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's true it was a Canadian, John Humphreys, who, sitting in the UN Secretariat, was absolutely played a key role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But if you read his memoirs, his biggest complaint was the Canadian government and the delegation. They wouldn't support him and even felt they were undermining him. So yes, a Canadian, but a Canadian working as a UN official, not pursuing Canadian government policy. But too few Canadians still remember this era when we were wary of the UN's human rights agenda. What was lurking behind the hostility we showed to the draft Universal Declaration of Human Rights? You have to go through, the people have looked at the historical record. There are a number of concerns. Concerns were expressed about the Universal Declaration's strong clauses on non-discrimination. It was said this would impact our, at that time, discriminatory immigration law. Of course, there were concerns expressed about how the non-discrimination clauses would impact on Canada's policy and law in relation to First Nations. There were worries about free speech issues, because a number of provinces had laws in place that criminalized, or not criminalized, but prohibited, or in other ways shut down communist parties or communist speech. There were very parochial concerns about federal, provincial jurisdictions, that somehow if a declaration would, if the federal government would agree, but that would impact on provincial. But this was, I say parochial because it was largely misunderstood by the bureaucrats raising it. And there was hostility to the inclusion in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of a right to education and a right to social security, these economic and social rights. So there were a variety of worries that were raised. They weren't quickly dealt with or cast aside. That position in 1948, it wasn't a snapshot of a moment in time, and suddenly, a couple of years later, we got with the program. Far from embracing international human rights, throughout the 1950s and 60s, Canada did little to advance UN work in this field. From 1949 onwards, the Commission on Human Rights, member states, sat down to draft, on the basis of the Universal Declaration, 2 international covenants. That work took them till 1966. Canada was not a help generally. I mean, I'm over 20 years. There may have been some issues where Canada was supportive, but Canada at the time was generally seen as obstructionist and difficult in that drafting process. And we were wary of signing on to international treaties. Canada refused to ratify the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees until 1969. Almost 20 years. There were similar delays of 10 years in ratifying the 2 international covenants, one on civil and political rights and one on economic and social rights. Now, some might argue, well, this was just a sign of the times. Human rights in the 50s and 1960s were a peripheral issue. They were not a major global issue. Canada wasn't paying attention, but so too of many other governments. Some might also argue that at the time, the Cold War had polarized the debate on human rights, the West championing civil and political rights, the Soviet bloc championing economic and social rights, such that it was very hard to make much progress in the UN debates. They were heavily politicized, as if they're not now, but that's true. And the result was the UN was not seen as playing an effective role to protect human rights. That's also true in this period, the 1950s and 60s. It's also true the UN was very ineffective. In fact, it wasn't possible to vote on human rights or even to speak about human rights in a particular country. You could have meetings on human rights at the UN, but you couldn't talk about human rights in Sri Lanka or Canada or Russia until about 1970, with the exception of apartheid South Africa. That's all true, but it doesn't account for the fact that countries Canada would think of as allies, including the UK, many European countries, not the US, it's an exception, were ratifying human rights treaties, including the Convention on Refugees. And of course, our European allies had drafted and signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, which set up a European Court and Commission of Human Rights and established a very rigorous regional system for the protection of human rights, which did subject all European countries, Western European countries, at that time Europe was split, to scrutiny, and even to an international court. The European Court in Strasbourg from the 1970s, late 60s onwards, was hearing individual cases and ruling on them. And there was also interstate complaint mechanisms. The UK, for example, was brought before the European Commission and Court in Strasbourg on 2 occasions in relation to Northern Ireland by other states, European states. So no, I think there was something deeper. Canadian ambivalence at the time was grounded in our own version of exceptionalism. We didn't really think we needed these treaties, and we wouldn't subject ourselves, or we were wary of subjecting ourselves to outside scrutiny. If you read, as I've done, the archival records of the discussions in the Immigration Department and in Cabinet on ratifying the Convention relating to the status of refugees throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Canada was repeatedly approached by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to ratify the treaty, particularly as, in some cases, we were accepting large numbers of refugees. In 1956, Hungary, 57,000 Hungarian refugees came to Canada, were taken after the suppression of the Hungarian uprising by the Soviets and their allies. And so we were actually accepting refugees, and the High Commissioner for Refugees was saying, please ratify the treaty. And the internal memos all say, no, we don't want that treaty. We're not sure it's going to remove our discretion. It's going to force us to do things. They say we're doing them anyway, but we choose to do them. And who is this UN that's now going to inquire about our domestic immigration policy? From the late 1960s onwards, something changed. We went, in a very short period of time, from being a laggard in relation to human rights at the UN to being a champion. And this was done in an accelerated way from when Pierre Trudeau had his last term as Prime Minister from 1980 to 84. Why? What changed? It's another speech. A lot of explanations. The fact that in 1976, when Jimmy Carter became US President, he said, I'm going to be the human rights president. That had an impact on Canada. The Helsinki Agreements in 1975 had an impact. We suddenly saw how human rights could be used to advance things we believed in, believed should change in the Soviet bloc. The rise to prominence of the international human rights movement. Amnesty International in 1961 was a very peripheral, small NGO in London. Throughout the 1960s, very few members in Canada. In 1977, Amnesty International won the Nobel Peace Prize. That was a defining moment. The international human rights movement, there were many other groups besides Amnesty, but that was a moment when suddenly it sort of came into its own. That had a big impact. And of course, crucially, Canada's own constitutional journey throughout the 1970s, which led towards the entrenchment of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. But the Charter, of course, the first drafts and the first thinking of it began in 1969. And throughout the 1970s, the idea of a charter was very much part of the political debate. Okay, but back to the main story. If the 1960s were a springboard for Canada's leap into leadership on human rights, maybe 20 years from now, we'll look back on our own times as the point at which we abandoned that role and reverted to type. Okay, why? Here's where this holds up or falls apart. But consider the record on the 3 points I mentioned, where I said at the beginning there was a retreat from universality. Point 1, opting out of international agreements. Point 2, determination to evade scrutiny. And point 3, increasing selectivity in relation to how we raise human rights issues in other countries. Okay? On point 1. Okay, let's just look at the record. In the past 10 years, there's been 8 human rights treaties, international agreements, formal treaties, open for signature, of which Canada has ratified 2. We have not ratified the Convention on Enforced Disappearances, and in the final stages of its negotiation, we were not terribly helpful. We have not ratified and show no intention of doing so the Protocol to the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. There's a new treaty which improves the Convention Against Torture. We have not yet ratified it. There's a new protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, improving its oversight mechanisms. We have not ratified it. Indeed, the only international human rights treaty we have ratified, the only explicit one, is the Disability Rights Convention, which was ratified in 2010. But even then, we didn't ratify the second piece of it, which is the scrutiny procedure, an international petition procedure, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also ratified a new treaty banning the production, use, sale, or transfer of cluster munitions, called the Cluster Munitions Convention. It's really a sort of law of war treaty, but has a humanitarian purpose, like the Landmines Convention. So you could put it in this bundle of human rights agreements. We did ratify that too, but even then in a constrained way, and I'll come back to that. In addition, although joining the Organization of American States in 1990, Canada is one of the very few countries in this hemisphere that has not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. We only joined the OAS in 1990. There was a proposal immediately afterwards to ratify the American Convention on Human Rights, which is part of this organization. It was actively considered in the 1990s. It got all the way to cabinet. A dispute arose largely about technical issues that I don't have time to go into. But when it went back down, it ended up in parliamentary committees which considered it as recently as 2004 and recommended ratification, but there's been no discussion at all since 2006. By not ratifying this treaty and showing no intention of doing so, we are also evading the possibility of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which sits in Costa Rica, and to which almost 30 states, individuals in almost 30 states in the Americas can petition to this court if they feel they haven't got redress at home. The Canadians have no access to that court. And then, of course, you will have heard, because it's more well known, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is not per se a treaty. It's a resolution of the General Assembly. But Canada voted against it in the General Assembly alongside a few other countries. We have since reversed that vote. We've indicated we now do accept the declaration. But it's interesting, we only did so, remember 1948, we only did so after the 3 of the other states, which had also voted against it, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, all said they were going to sign on to it. Canada was looking very much alone again. And similar to 1948, said that we now supported the declaration subject to a number of concerns. I won't even consider international treaties outside the human rights era to which Canada has also either not ratified or ratified and pulled out of, Kyoto being the most famous example, but I'll park those issues. But there are other agreements that touch on human rights, very important agreements, less well known, or let's say more obscure, that we're refusing to be bound by. I don't know if any of you have heard of EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So this is an agreement reached by a group of states. The basic idea is simple. States voluntarily sign on, and in signing on, they agree that in contracting with the extractive sector, mining, oil and gas, there will be transparency in all of the contractual arrangements and crucially in relation to the royalties. The idea being that in many countries, Nigeria not only, but elsewhere in Africa, countries were signing deals with foreign extractive companies. They weren't transparent. The result was local people had no idea what the royalty arrangement was and no way to track the money, right? So no way to counter the corruption. But this has a human rights component as well, because transparency in contracting tends to lead to better results in actually how the mining proceeds. Of course, I think some of you will know, the extractive sector need not damage human rights, but it's more likely to, because you need a big space, you have to displace people, you have pollutants, etc. So there's always human rights concerns around these things, and the idea is if you can get transparency in contracting, local civil society can be involved and have a say. Okay. This was originally conceived of as something developing countries could sign. Canada's been very supportive. We've paid money into the Secretariat. There's a monitoring mechanism, very sophisticated. Companies are involved, extractive companies. We've been very supportive, but some of these countries in Africa, this thing took off in 2004, and some of these African countries said, wait a minute, Canada, Norway, US, Australia, like, you're promoting this, but why don't you sign it? You know, if we have to sign it, it's pretty rigorous. It's hard. There's a lot of you going to come and monitor us. Okay, we're going through these procedures. Why aren't you? And the Norwegians finally broke ranks, and they said, you know what, they have a point. So Norway actually wasn't just supporting. Norway said, we're going to become also an EITI implementing country. Then Australia said they were going to become an EITI implementing country. And 18 months ago, President Obama said the US is going to become an EITI implementing country. Canada, hello, extractive sector. We are the single most important extractive place in the world to raise money for the extractive sector. We have a huge extractive sector active in this country. And yet our government has refused to consider becoming an implementing country under EITI. We're completely isolated. Okay, the government, on some of these treaties I've been talking about, the government has simply said it's no intention to ratify at all. For example, the Convention on Enforced Disappearances, some of these optional protocols. In regards to the treaty which improves the Convention Against Torture, the government has pledged to consider ratification, but there's no measures underway to do so. On other agreements, the government just hasn't commented either way. But if you ask people in foreign affairs, there's no policy process underway to move pull the levers that need to be pulled if we're going to ratify the agreement. Why not? Remember, this is the point about standing outside. Okay, is it just because these treaties aren't relevant to Canada? Well, that's not true for the EITI, but what a Convention on Enforced Disappearance. You know what enforced disappearance is? This is what happened in Latin America, right? People are seized, the government pretends they don't have them, later on we find them dead, the government says, well, we don't know what happened. So this is a very important convention, but there's not disappearances in Canada, so why should we ratify it? Well, some of its provisions actually affect Canada, because, for example, there's a provision in the convention that says you have to punish people responsible for enforced disappearances. You have to apply universal jurisdiction. In other words, if those people are in Canada, they have to be tried in Canada, even if the crime was committed elsewhere, or be extradited. And the convention also says you can't return people to countries where they're at risk of forced disappearance. Those two provisions seem to be what's keeping Canada from its failure to ratify. Well, I won't go into it, but on this improved treaty to the Torture Convention establishes a system of on-site monitoring. So a international committee with a few weeks' notice can appear in Canada and visit our prisons. The government has said they're considering ratification of this, but as I said, hasn't done so. So is it because they're not relevant? Well, maybe, but if that's true, let's look at the record of similarly situated countries, our allies, European countries, the Australians. We can't look at the US. We know they're an exceptionalist country. If you look at the new torture treaty, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, they've all signed or ratified. Almost all European countries have too. The Convention on Enforced Disappearances, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, there's 91 signatories and ratifications. The Protocol to the Disability Rights Convention, Australia, the United Kingdom, Sweden, France, almost all the other European countries. EITI, I've already said, Norway, Australia, the US. So these are also countries where you could argue this relevance point, but they seem to be ratifying. So maybe it's a problem of Canada's federal system. There are particularities. We have a strongly decentralized country. It does make it difficult. It's true, it does make it difficult to ratify international treaties. But we're not the only federation. 1/8 of the UN's member states, 25 countries, have federal systems. Australia, Switzerland, South Africa, Germany, some of those, like Switzerland, are far more decentralized than Canada. So it can't be the problem of federations. No, it's a deeper ambivalence. I think this record says that there's a new determination not to sign on to rules that would actually require us to change our law and policy in any way. It's not just that we don't ratify. In some cases where we do, the implementing legislation actually, in effect, puts us in breach of the treaty. The most egregious example recently is the Cluster Weapons Convention that I mentioned. Cluster weapons are, I probably don't have time, but basically it's a big bomb with a lot of little bombs. You fire them in artillery shells or you drop them from airplanes. The problem is they're meant to be an area denial weapon. When they fall, they disperse and they can kill large numbers of troops, let's say, who are advancing up a hill, something like that. The problem is, it's a debate, but between 5 and 20% of these little bombs fail to explode, and they land in the ground, and then they're just like an anti-personnel landmine. Exactly the same argument. Okay. Canada was very active in negotiating the convention. But those of you who are law students, you know an international treaty isn't law in Canada until you pass implementing legislation. Canada did that recently, and in that convention, there's an exemption clause. It basically says, when we're doing joint military operations with non-state parties, or when Canadian forces are on secondment to non-state parties, Canadian soldiers can authorize or even use cluster munitions. The government said, well, if we don't do that, we have a problem with the United States because it refuses to ratify this convention. Well, it didn't stop the United Kingdom from ratifying and passing legislation that didn't provide such a loophole. There's something else going on. Okay, that's our record on opting out. The second point, resistance to scrutiny. Note, it's not accidental that many of these treaties I've mentioned are not treaties that, with the exception of the Disability Rights Convention, they're not creating substantive new rights. They're taking existing treaties and setting up new international scrutiny procedures. That's true of almost all the 6 treaties I mentioned. They set up new international scrutiny procedures. Maybe they allow you as Canadians, if we were to ratify, to petition a panel or a court. Maybe they allow this committee I mentioned, the Committee Against Torture, to visit Canadian prisons, but they set up new and additional scrutiny procedures. So the non-ratification and the scrutiny point go together. Contrast, in 1999, there was a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women. Canada ratified it in the 1980s, very quickly. In 1999, there was a new protocol added to it, allowing the right of individual petition to this committee that was protecting women's rights. And Canada, within 2 years, had ratified that protocol. But when we ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2010, there was a protocol attached to it that allowed you to, again, granting this right of individual petition. We didn't, right? There's a pattern. There's a pattern here. Some scrutiny we can't avoid. As a UN member state, the Human Rights Council, made up of member states, Canada can be on it, has been, you get voted on and off, etc. But the Human Rights Council has a number of procedures. They apply to all UN member states, regardless of which treaties you ratified. So we can't avoid those. And we have ratified some treaties that have existing procedures. So we are subject to scrutiny, but consider what's happened just in the last 22 months under this government. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a very knowledgeable international law professor, James Anaya, University of Arizona, sent a note expressing some concern about the housing crisis faced by the Indigenous people at Attawapiskat. The government's response was to say he was waging a publicity stunt. That's a quote. When the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, visited Canada last year, government ministers, this isn't backbenchers, government ministers unleashed a barrage of personal insults and criticisms, including in Parliament and in the media. He was told he had wasted money that could be spent on food aid by choosing to have a mission to Canada, and they should not get involved in political exercises in developed democracies like Canada. The parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that, quote, "It's an insult to Canadians and their tax dollars that this fellow came over here to waste the dollars that they have contributed to the UN," unquote. When the Committee Against Torture when Canada was asked to appear before it, as every country subject to the treaty is asked to do every 4 years, was nothing unusual. And the committee gave many positive comments on Canada's record, although it had concerns. But a government spokesman said, quote, "In times when there are serious concerns regarding human rights violations across the world, it's disappointing that the UN would spend its time decrying Canada," unquote. When the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, again, periodically reviewed Canada, as it does every country, one of the government spokesperson dismissed the committee's concern and questioned anything they could say about Canada based on the nationality of one of the members on the committee. Okay, point 3, selectivity. I don't have time to develop this at length, so I'll maybe just mention 2 points. No country is perfect. Every country in its foreign policy tends to be more concerned about human rights issues in its foes than in its friends, right? This is almost an inevitable consequence of world politics. So my expectation is not that Canada would have a perfect record, and in fact it rarely has on this, as right, it's very hard to find a country that has a perfect record of impartiality and non-selectivity in how it promotes human rights in the world. But I maybe just raise one point, because I do want to leave time for questions. 2 weeks ago, you know what's happening in Syria. You know that 60,000 people have been killed. You know that meaningful Security Council action is blocked by Russia and China. Some of you may also know that it is possible Syria is not party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So the prosecutor sitting in The Hague cannot investigate and indict those responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity in Syria. But there is a provision in the Rome Statute that allows the Security Council to refer a case to the International Criminal Court, even if that country hasn't ratified, okay? It's done this twice, in Darfur, Sudan, and 2 years ago in Libya. The Security Council took action, said, we refer the case under the terms of the Rome Statute to the prosecutor. And as you probably know, that led to indictments of leadership figures in Sudan responsible for the atrocities in Darfur and in Libya. Now, we can debate the effectiveness of this, but 2 weeks ago, the Swiss felt that they had to bring additional pressure to bear on the Security Council to do something about Syria. And they thought that if they just brought a demand to the Security Council that asked the Security Council to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court, and they didn't focus on the political transition or speak of other sanctions, that maybe the Russians and the Chinese could be persuaded to abstain. 56 countries signed the letter that the Swiss sent to the Security Council. Every single one of Canada's allies, with the exception of the US, signed that letter, and we didn't. And the Foreign Minister hasn't explained this. I'm not doubting the Canadian government's concern about human rights issues and abuses in Syria. I'm not doubting that John Baird is sincere when he speaks out against this abuse. But why won't we ask the Security Council to invoke the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction in Syria, a court we helped to build and create, being used against one of today's most heinous criminals, Bashar al-Assad? Now, would this initiative succeed? Probably not. Was it wishful thinking? Not quite. But it does send a powerful signal when 56 countries go to the Security Council and make that demand. And the Syrian regime noticed. They denounced it. They were in New York. They spoke against it. They're worried about things like this. They notice who signed and who didn't. Canada didn't sign. What I'm saying is not that Canada has made a full-scale retreat from defending human rights internationally. Our foreign minister speaks about it all the time. He's got particular issues, freedom of religion, the prohibitions on child marriage, lesbian and gay issues. He's outspoken on many countries which are egregious abusers of human rights: Iran, Syria, Pakistan, others. Canada isn't threatening to withdraw from treaties we've already signed. And we continue to contribute substantial funds to the UN Human Rights Program, although rumors persist, unverified, that this is something that might not continue. But if we recall this past, if we recall the Canadian wariness about international human rights in the 1950s and 60s, this tendency may not be a new trend, and maybe the title shouldn't be the emergence of of an exceptionalism, but the re-emergence of a Canadian wariness about the promotion, about international, about the prominence given to human rights in our foreign policy as it implicates Canada within that system. Maybe this is not so intrinsic as we think to Canadian global citizenship. We as Canadians, we scoff at the U.S. Understandably so, if you look at the debate on gun control there now. But in the last 4 years of the Obama presidency, it is the Americans who have been abandoning their exceptionalism, even as our government appears to embrace it. President Obama sent 2 treaties to the Senate for ratification. The Senate hasn't done it yet, but he sent them there. That's a very important step. The U.S. is engaged with the Human Rights Council in powerful and forceful ways on a number of resolutions and issues. It's shown full support for the universal periodic review process in the Human Rights Council, by which every state has to appear and for 3 hours have a public debate on its human rights record. Every state, without exception. The U.S. engaged with that and is supporting this process as a way to try and show that everyone is subject to the same standards. Those of you who follow the press will know 2 days ago, Israel said it wouldn't appear. Israel has reasons to be concerned about the partiality or impartiality of the UN's human rights program. That's true. But Israel is the first country that said we won't cooperate with this process. The U.S. immediately issued a statement saying, please, that's not the way to deal with the problem of unfair criticism. Canada issued no such statement. And the U.S. has given increased funding for civil society efforts at home and abroad, even as Canada reduces funding to human rights NGOs. The Canadian Centre, that's most of us, most of us in Canada, we used to worry about the neocons south of the border. Well, maybe we should wake up and realize that they've taken up residence on Parliament Hill. Thank you. So, questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we can pass the microphone around for questions.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'm Gerald Heckman. I teach constitutional and admin law here. And I had 2 questions. I'll read them very quickly. I know that there have been substantial cuts at Foreign Affairs, and I'm just wondering how many of the people who are responsible for assessing the impact of treaties, interacting with the United Nations, how many of these people have been fired, essentially? How much capacity have we lost to pursue our international engagement? And the second question was, and this is just a question, not a criticism, but how can you really measure our ally states' engagement or respect for international human rights by the fact that they're ratifying treaties, rather than looking at whether or not they're actually observing or complying with the treaties? Are they simply being more hypocritical? You could say, well, the present government is not ratifying these treaties because it has no intention of observing any of the norms, and isn't it being honest about all of this? So. Yeah, no. On the first question, I don't know. That's the short answer. I really don't know. I do meet people, and they're big, strong legal teams and treaty teams. So there have been cutbacks. I don't know if it's affected this program. On the ratification, is a really good point. What does ratification mean? So I'm not suggesting that ratification equals compliance. Clearly, it doesn't, including in our own case. We could talk about Vic Tave's instructions in relation to use of information gathered under torture. But this isn't, I'm just saying that in terms of this idea that we don't need to, that we can respect human rights without signing up to international agreements. That's for others. This is what's driving the last 6 years to 10 years of policy. And our other allies who may also have concerns about the UN and its scrutiny, who may also feel that their domestic record on human rights is very good, still feel the need to engage in that international system. That's my point. But you're right, it may be that in relation to some of these agreements, for example, on the situation in Canadian prisons, that this
new committee, this new anti-torture committee would investigate, maybe the situation's better than in the UK and in Switzerland and in Poland and other countries that ratified. Absolutely. But the idea of the universal, the key idea here, and this is telling in the government's response, the key idea is not that of universality, is that there's room for improvement everywhere, right? And I think this is what the government's missed. They feel we've got to a point where we alone can decide and determine whether in our courts, we trust our courts enough that no one else need inquire into whether Canada's meeting the standards or not. So our performance judged objectively may be better, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. And so long as there is, the idea of universality suggests that you ought to improve. You know, the right to education is understood differently in Canada than in Botswana, right? Because its resources are relevant to its realization. So, but it's not about compliance, and it's a good point. Yes, here.
Hi, my name is Brighton Owen. Hi, my name is Brighton. I'm a second-year law student. I was just curious about the possibility of if the UN is the best way to evaluate human rights or not. I know initially when the Harper government was elected, there was some strong criticism of China not affiliated with any treaty. And I know that having looked at some of the UN committee members, oftentimes it seems that the human rights committees have countries such as Syria, Iran, Libya sitting on them, which Israel certainly has suffered from. As a result, Israel's been called numerous times. Whether or not that's justified was certainly another debate. But then to have Canada also appear before such countries as well, could that not be the government's way of saying the UN is not the best method for human rights? Perhaps there's another system.
Oh, yeah. Again, a good question. The only place where we appear and get judged by countries is in the Human Rights Council under its universal periodic review. Okay? It's an idea of peer review. So what is peer review? It means peers, in this case states, have a kind of dialogue around their record. Peer review isn't just at the Human Rights Council. At the WTO, every country, every 3 years or 4 years, has to go up for peer review on its trade policy. Your trade policy is debated, all the other countries get to comment. The idea is to promote a dialogue and transparency. The old problem at the Human Rights Council was countries that had enough votes against them, you could debate their human rights record. And so those countries, Israel, but many others, said that's not fair, which was kind of in some cases true. So the idea of UPR is that everybody, every 4 years, has to present their record, okay? But that's when countries, and yes, it's a bit crazy. If you can watch Canada's peer review. Canada's coming up again in May for peer review. You can watch the peer review from 2008. And you have the Iranian asking Canada all these questions and shaming them and stuff. But that's, there's a lot of other stuff happening. Yes, it's easy to say the Iranians use it to criticize us or whatever, but there's a lot of other things happening in that room. The other committees are all made up of independent experts. And yes, it's true. Sometimes they're less independent than we could hope. But is the answer to that to disengage or to get involved and lobby and work behind the scenes and get better people elected to those committees? And that's what we're not doing. Because we can't do it. Because we can't expect to be heard and other countries to treat us seriously when we ourselves are perceived to be belittling and deriding those procedures. They're far from perfect. I mean, I've spent way too many hours and days of my life sitting in rooms with those committees. They're far from perfect. But the record over time of those committees and what they've done to improve human rights in many countries, including this country, people aren't aware of that. Many things that we assume are developed because of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the very language of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms was powerfully influenced by international human rights treaties, including Article 1, the democratic. So, yes, we have we should be proud of our Charter, but there are issues that our Charter, our courts came to recognize as abuse because of international treaty practice in other countries. For example, the idea that you can't return people to countries where they're subject to the death penalty. That was justified under our Charter, but it's undeniable that the impact on our Supreme Court in that decision was overwhelmingly derived from an international practice which was based in international standards. So yes, long answer, yes, there's problems with the UN committees, but the only way to to solve that is to work to improve them.
And if I could just sort of just build on that a little bit, and I know we're probably running out of time here, but when you said about the OPCAT, the Optional Protocol on the Convention Against Torture, and that regime, that's something that I'm quite interested in my work that I do around prisons and oversight and accountability of imprisonment. And when you mention the situation of Canada's prisons, I mean, that is actually, they aren't better than in the UK. I just got back from the UK where I was interviewing their...
I said maybe.
Yeah, no, and I actually got, so I'm not saying they're great in the UK either, but what they do have in the UK is a really strong commitment to oversight and accountability of their prisons, which comes from their having signed the optional protocol. Which that means not that you just subject yourself to international experts coming in. You also have to have what's called a national preventative mechanism. So it requires countries to do their own work, to investigate what's going on in places of detention, for example, so that then they can then say, look, we've satisfied ourselves that we are doing some oversight, that we are living up to our own commitments and international human rights norms, and then there is the oversight body that can come in. But it's actually really helpful to change conditions of confinement. I was skeptical when I went over to see what work they were doing, but it's actually quite remarkable. What it's called the prison inspectorate over there, and it's all related to the work of the.
And actually, that's a good example because that committee, a deep personal friend of mine, someone I actually shared a flat with for 3 years in London, is a member of that committee. So I know it's quite well in its work because whenever I'm in Geneva, I see him. They're actually very independent and very expert. They're lucky because states that really engage got good members onto the committee. Almost all of them are lawyers with human rights experience. They have criminologists. They have comparative. So they've got a really strong group of people. And to sort of stand back from this is just, it's inexplicable. Yeah, here, the back. Oh, sorry. Oh, I can see okay.
Yeah, Edward Lipsitz, a law graduate and independent researcher and writer. 2 questions are unrelated, so I'll ask one at a time. First of all, do you think it might be too easy for Canada to ratify treaties? That, of course, is a Crown prerogative. I know you have to have parliamentary action to have them actually part of Canadian law, but ratification puts us under a duty in international law. So do you not think a system like in the United States, I think it has to have 2/3 ratification in the Senate or in other jurisdictions, some legislative consent should be necessary for rebound in international law? It's a
bigger question. I'm actually pleased that treaty ratification is an executive power in Canada, because the result in the United States of requiring a 2/3 vote in the Senate is that they couldn't ratify the Convention Against Genocide, which was adopted in 1948, until 1988. That's embarrassing. It took 40 years for the U.S. Senate to agree that they should sign a convention which was against genocide. So, because because it becomes a political. So I'm glad it's an executive power in Canada would be my short answer, but it's really a bigger debate. But the point is, yes, by ratifying, you do have a duty to put implementing legislation in, and that can be hard. And in a federation, I want to be fair to the government, it's harder in a federation like Canada to get your implementing legislation right, because you want to avoid constitutional challenges as well, right? So you have to negotiate with the provinces. All that's difficult. My point is, it's not even happening. Look, if these 6 or 8 treaties I'm talking about are the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, there were committees in Ottawa and policy processes, my argument would fall flat. But none of that's happening. The government is simply, with the exception of OPCAT, they're ignoring it. On an OPCAT, the story's been the same for now 8 years, which is we're considering it. But anytime anyone asks, well, where are you at, you don't get an answer.
I'll try to sneak in one last question here.
Thank you very much for the lecture today. My question is in regards to what is responsible for this exceptional shift, if you will, in Canada's foreign policy. You've touched on some of the history of it leading up to now, but what is responsible at this point? And I submit to you maybe a simplistic view, but the individuals in the decision-making power today do you think their personal views, their religious views, their backgrounds could be responsible for that? And the reason I bring that up is because you brought up John Baird and his support for certain groups versus, and for example, Stephen Harper and so on. And I listened to the examples you were giving with the cluster bombs, the ICC, and I see that while they may not affect Canada directly, but it does affect groups or countries that those individuals may have interests in. And so I wonder if that's the shift. That's
okay.
A reason for remarks.
I won't speculate on Stephen Harper or John Baird and the treaties. Their personal views, all of that may influence this. I think what I'd like to argue, and I can't, it's going to require a lot more research. What I feel is interesting is that all Canadians have a vision of ourselves in the world. The last 6 years are clearly not that vision, and yet the government is not really getting the rap for that. So that leads me to believe that there's a significant constituency in Canada, and I don't want to belittle that, which does have this sense that we don't really need this stuff. Maybe we're more like Americans than Europeans, because the government isn't doing it, and there is no international pressure or no domestic pressure in relation to almost any of these issues I've raised, with some exceptions. So I think this, I'm suggesting to you that maybe, and I posit it needs a lot more research, but maybe the last 30 years of activism internationally, maybe that was the aberration, as opposed to what we're seeing now. This is what's interesting to me, and that's why I went back to 1948. On the ICC, I will say, why did we not sign the letter? The only other country like us that didn't sign was Sweden. And the Swedish foreign minister said, criminal indictment of Assad is a bad idea. It means he's got no exit. I don't think that's what our foreign minister thought, because he's always talking about principles, right? And I don't think it was about a political. So maybe he thought that, maybe the point was Baird didn't sign because he thought it's never going to happen. The Security Council is never going to do this. What's the point of wasting my time? Again, that just doesn't strike me. That's a kind of pragmatic, it's just not in sort of our foreign minister's approach to these issues. We want to be principled. The principled thing to do is to sign the letter, right? And to sort of send a signal to Assad. So none of those explanations holds true for me. The third explanation is Palestine is now a UN permanent observer member state of the UN, okay? That vote happened in the General Assembly in November. That means Palestine can now join international agreements. There'll be debates about some of them, but Palestine likely will be permitted to ratify the statute of the International Criminal Court if it chooses to do so. That's been a deep concern of the Israeli government vis-a-vis Palestinian statehood, okay? Now, if it does so, given the foreign minister's very strong support for Israel, I can't dismiss this argument. I can't say that's what it is, and I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that's why we didn't sign, but of the three arguments I've heard, that one has something in it that the other two don't. I think it's a ludicrous argument because, of course, if Palestine ratified the statute and then asked the court to investigate human rights abuses in the Palestinian-occupied territories, I think the Palestinians realized really quickly, the very first thing the prosecutors are going to look at is Hamas's rockets. The very first thing. Because without any doubt, they're a war crime. You don't even have to do an investigation because they're not aimed at military targets. Whereas the Israeli abuses are much more complex because you're going to have to always go through a very complex thing to determine, was it an indiscriminate attack? Was it anyway, those are laws of war stuff. We don't have the details. So this idea that if Palestine ratifies, that all of a sudden Israeli generals are going to be indicted by the ICC is just, it's fear-mongering. It's crazy. Anyway, but I don't know. I don't know why these things are happening, but I believe that there's something deep within us maybe that isn't outraged by the fact that we're retreating from this.
And on that note, I think we'll have to wrap up. I'm sure you all agree that a lot of the points that David has made would be of interest to a lot of people who aren't in this room. And Adrian is going to be posting this talk online, so I would encourage everyone to talk to other law students or people in political science who might be interested in hearing this talk. It'll be up probably early next week, I'm guessing, with Adrian's usual efficiency. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Helen Falding, who's the manager of the Centre for Human Rights Research. And so I'd like to thank David on behalf of both Robson Hall and the Centre for Human Rights Research. And you get your very own water bottle.
This is great. Last year, when I spoke, they gave me a bottle of wine, really good one, and I had to rush straight to the airport. And of course, as I rushed straight through the airport, and I was like, it was confiscated. I couldn't fly, so I had to hand over this $40 bottle of wine.
I think you're allowed to keep this,
yeah,
as long as you don't have water in it.
Thank you.
The Centre for Human Rights Research brought David to town this week because he's contributing a chapter to a book on the idea of a human rights museum, and we're having a workshop for all the chapter contributors for the next couple of days. So he's doing double duty while he's here. So I'd like to thank him for doing that as well.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.